heading out, it's good to know that 13,000 Victoria Police are keeping communities safe. And when you're catching a train, we'll be there too. Police have new powers to tackle crime gangs and seize their assets, stopping drugs like ice before they reach the street. Tough new laws are putting violent offenders behind bars for longer, and suspended sentences have been abolished. So if anyone's thinking about making trouble, think again, because we're building a safer Victoria. Authorised by the Victorian Government, Melbourne.
You're watching The World from Below, and that was a recent advertisement put out by the Victorian Government highlighting their reforms in respect of criminal justice, in particular the abolition of suspended sentences and tougher sentences generally. We spent the last part of our program discussing the role of sentencing in the criminal justice system. There is a well-known Tasmanian study which found that, in abstract terms, most people think that sentences imposed by the courts are too lenient. But when people are provided with more information on a particular case, similar to the information a judge would have, they would impose a very similar sentence to the judge. Indeed, when provided with more information about actual specific cases, the public would have given lower sentences in 3 out of the 4 cases compared to the judge. Pauline, what factors do you take into account, and what kind of flexibility is available in sentencing in your work as a magistrate?
Well, look, there are so many things that we take into account because everyone's different and every situation is different. And so, maybe issues of age, whether they've actually offended before, what their the gravity and seriousness of the offences, the effect on the victim, whether they've got prospects of rehabilitation, good family support, employment, whether they have an alcohol and drug addiction, what they've done to overcome that. So there are so many different factors, and it's hard to actually say that it can be a one-size-fits-all because it just isn't. And so that's why flexibility in sentencing is very important, because then we can properly take into account all those different factors and come up with a sentence that's just. Our sentencing options in Victoria are quite, there's quite a few, and it allows us some flexibility in terms of different options like imprisonment and community corrections orders, fines, and combinations of those things, undertakings where they have to do certain courses and things like that. So there is quite a bit of flexibility. Obviously, there's been the loss recently of suspended sentences, which were useful because in some cases they acted as a deterrent, particularly in family violence matters, where we could have a sentence of imprisonment hanging over a perpetrator's head, but also then provide them with options of treatment and means behaviour change programs and those sorts of things. So that was a useful combination that we've now lost. But I think the key is for me in doing my job every day, the greater the flexibility, the more I can come up with something that's appropriate.
So people often feel that, that it's often you read the newspaper and there's outrage over a sentence that people say is too lenient on abstract. Usually that's related to the offence rather than the other factors you were talking about. Bronwyn, why do you think the public holds such misconceptions about sentencing, and what can we do to improve it?
It's a really important question. I mean, I think the reality is, first of all, that we don't actually have a lot of crime in Australia, relatively speaking. So fortunately, most people don't actually have much personal experience of crime. So where they get their information from is really important, and of course where they get the information from tends to be from the media. And the media then has its own agendas in terms of what it reports and how it reports it. So we have screaming headlines, hysterical coverage of crime. Crime is seen as highly newsworthy for a range of interesting social and cultural reasons in Australia. Not the case in all countries, but in countries like Australia and most of the Anglo countries, for example, we do have media which places a very high priority on reporting crime. As one journalist said to me, I'm sure this is commonplace, if it bleeds, it leads. Right. So what we get is a sort of very salient stories about crime, so that people who haven't got their own experience to draw on are saying, well, it must be a really big problem. We also, of course, get a huge coverage of crimes against the person, homicides and so on. I mean, in Victoria in the last year or so, we had something like 150 murders, which is a lot, but then we had 40,000 shop stealings, so we didn't get that story from the press. What we got from the press was that we're all at risk of being murdered, by strangers preferably, whereas again the data shows if we're going to be murdered, it's likely to be someone that we know who murders us as well. So the stories from the media are really quite skewed, but that's where people get their information. So I think that leads people to feel very afraid and to feel that they need to separate themselves, that society needs to separate itself from these perpetrators, put them away for a long time, and so on. The interesting situation that you see, as you mentioned in your introduction about the Tasmanian study, is that when people then find out more about an offender and actually find out more about them as a human being, and hear the story of their own history, their background, the nature of the offending and the degree of seriousness of the offending, how the victim reacted and so on, they can then actually be much more balanced. And as the research has shown, they'll tend to sentence something around the range that the judge sentences themselves.
What I find really interesting in my work is that you feel like there's a separation between victims and criminals, but actually most of the people who are coming before me as offenders are actually also victims of crimes themselves. So a lot of young men who are coming before me have been victims of family violence when they were children. They have been victims of abuse, sexual abuse, and then they've developed drug and alcohol problems because of that, and so then they end up in our system as offenders. And a lot of women who are using drugs, often if you look at what's happened to them, there's a lot of issues around sexual abuse and family violence. So a lot of young people who are coming through the child protection system as victims of abuse then end up being offenders because through the child protection system they get exposed to a whole lot of other types of young people who are offending, and then they start offending themselves. So it's very interesting that we kind of think that there's this artificial distinction between us and them, victims and offenders, but actually from what I see they're often the same group of people.
And that's all we have time for on this week's episode of The World from Below. I'd like to thank our guest, Magistrate Pauline Spencer, and Associate Professor Bronwyn Naylor. I would also like to thank all our crew and producers and our host RMI TV. You've been watching The World from Below. Thanks for joining us.